welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into a really compelling and pretty intricate legal situation. The case of Abrego Garcia's removal.
Yes, it's definitely a significant one.
And what makes this so relevant, I think, for anyone following politics, governance, how laws actually get applied, it really throws into sharp relief these fundamental ideas of due process.
Right, and the inherent tensions between the executive branch and the courts.
Exactly. And how immigration law and, administrative procedures actually work on the ground.
Definitely. And for people who track legislation and government action, this case is a particularly stark example. We've got a good amount of material here, court documents, actual legal citations.
Yeah, things like the APA, the INA.
And of course, the news coverage that followed it all.
So our goal, our mission for this deep dive, is to methodically unpack the key legal arguments, the sequence of events, really understand what happened.
And maybe more importantly, why it matters in the bigger picture of our legal system.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Take us back to 2019.
All right, so the record shows Abrego Garcia entered the U.S. Around 2011.
Okay.
Then, fast forward to March 2019, he's arrested in Maryland. And this arrest kicks off the formal removal proceedings against him.
And he acknowledged he was removable, legally speaking.
He did concede removability, yes, but he didn't just accept deportation. He applied for protection specifically, asylum, withholding of removal, and also protection under CT, the Convention Against Torture.
Okay, seeking multiple avenues there.
But interestingly, early on, the immigration judge denied him bond.
Why was that?
It was based on an alleged affiliation with MS-13. Now, we should note, a source apparently verified this, but Abrego Garcia himself always denied it.
Denied any involvement. That detail seems important later on.
It definitely becomes a recurring point.
So even with the bond denial and the move towards removal, there was a pretty significant ruling in October 2019, wasn't there?
That's right. The IJ, the immigration judge, ordered his removal, but at the same time granted him withholding of removal specifically to El Salvador.
And the basis for that?
Credible threats he faced from a different gang, Barrio 18, related to his family's pupusa business back in El Salvador.
Okay, let's pause there. For listeners, what exactly does withholding of removal mean in practice?
Good question. It's a specific protection. It's not like getting a green card, but it legally stops the government from deporting someone to that specific country where they fear persecution.
So he couldn't be sent to El Salvador?
Not unless that withholding order was legally terminated through a proper process.
And did the government fight that decision? Did they appeal?
No, crucially, they didn't appeal the judge's decision.
Interesting. So what happened to him then?
Well, after getting that withholding order, Abrego Garcia was actually released from IC custody. So for a while, he was living here with that legal protection.
Even though there was still technically a removal order on the books?
Exactly. The withholding order superseded deportation to El Salvador.
Right, which then makes the events of March 2025 seem pretty abrupt.
Very abrupt. A really sharp, unexpected turn.
What happened?
On March 12th, 2025, ICE arrested him again.
Okay, on what grounds this time?
The stated reason was his, quote, prominent role in MS-13. And he was apparently just told his status had changed.
His status had changed. But wasn't the withholding order still technically active?
That's the critical point. No new legal proceedings were started at that moment to actually change his status or terminate that withholding order.
So it just happened?
It seems so. And things moved incredibly fast after that arrest.
How fast?
He was shuffled between multiple detention facilities very quickly. And then, just 3 days later, March 15th, he was deported. Put on a plane to El Salvador.
3 days. And sent to El Salvador, the one country he had protection against being sent to.
Precisely. And this happened, again, with no formal termination of the withholding order, no new court case, nothing to legally justify overriding that protection.
Wow. And wasn't there something else going on around the same time involving other deportations?
Yes, that adds another layer. His removal happened alongside the deportation of some Venezuelan nationals under the Alien Enemies Act.
The Alien Enemies Act. That's quite an old law, isn't it?
Very old. It gives the executive branch broad powers over non-citizens from countries the U.S. is, say, at war with or in certain other situations. It's not typically used like this.
So the legal justification for his specific removal, separate from the Venezuelans, was murky.
Extremely murky. They mentioned the MS-13 allegation again, but the actual legal authority used seemed unclear, especially given the existing withholding order.
And there was also reporting about payments, right?
Yes. Reports emerged that the U.S. government was actually paying El Salvador to detain these individuals, including Abrego Garcia, in a facility called CCOT.
CCOT, that's the Terrorism Confinement Center.
That's the one. Known for very harsh conditions. This payment detail raises, significant ethical questions, legal questions about the whole operation.
It really paints a picture. So, unsurprisingly, this led to a legal challenge back here.
Absolutely, almost immediately. This is where the district court gets involved.
What did his lawyers argue?
They filed for injunctive relief, fast. Their main arguments were that the removal violated the withholding statute itself, violated his due process rights, both procedural and substantive. Basically, the government broke its own rules and his fundamental rights.
And how did the district court respond?
They took it very seriously. On April 4th, 2025, the court granted a preliminary injunction.
An injunction meaning?
Meaning they ordered the government to do something, specifically to facilitate and effectuate Abrego Garcia's return to the U.S.
Facilitate and effectuate.
Okay.
And they set a deadline.
A very tight one. By April 7th. Just 3 days.
That's incredibly fast for this kind of court order involving international movement. What was the court's reasoning for such strong action?
The judge found Abrego Garcia was likely to win his case eventually. The core finding was that the removal just flat out violated the withholding order and lacked any due process.
So a clear legal violation in the court's view.
Yes. And the court also heavily weighed the irreparable harm he was likely facing in CCOT, given its reputation.
Did they consider anything beyond the harm to him personally?
They did. They looked at the balance of equities, sort of fairness, and the public interest. The court felt both strongly favored bringing him back immediately.
And they called the relief, ordering his return, the narrowest possible remedy.
Right, meaning, in their view, it was the minimum necessary action to fix the immediate legal problem.
And the court specifically mentioned the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA. How did that fit in?
Yes, that's key to the legal reasoning. The court pointed to the APA and cited some major Supreme Court cases.
Oh, which ones?
Cases like FCC v. Fox, Regents of UC, State Farm, Perez v. Cuccinelli. Basically, these cases say courts must set aside agency actions that are arbitrary, capricious, or just not following the law.
So the district court saw the removal as arbitrary.
Essentially, yes. They reasoned the government disregarded a valid legal order, the withholding, and changed course without any explanation or legal basis. An agency can't just ignore its own rules or prior decisions silently.
Okay, so that's a pretty strong finding from the district court. But the government didn't just accept that, did they?
No, definitely not. They immediately took it upstairs, filed an emergency application with the Supreme Court.
Trying to stop the district court's order.
Exactly. Asking the Supreme Court to block the order, put it on hold, grant a stay, and ultimately to vacate it entirely.
And what grounds did the government argue to the Supreme Court?
They had several key arguments. First, jurisdiction. They argued the district court didn't even have the power to hear the case under immigration law, specifically Section 1252G.
That section limits court review of removal execution, right?
That's the government's interpretation, yes. Second, they argued the order interfered with the president's Article 2 powers over foreign relations.
How so?
By essentially ordering the government to negotiate with El Salvador to get him back. They felt that crossed into foreign policy territory reserved for the executive branch.
Okay, the separation of powers argument. What else?
They called the April 7th deadline arbitrary and impossible. Just couldn't be done that fast.
Practical concerns.
Right. And they brought up the MS-13 allegation again. They argued that if he was involved with MS-13, another part of the law, 1231b3, might make him ineligible for withholding anyway.
Kind of revisiting the underlying eligibility question.
Sort of. And finally, they gave assurances that people sent to CCOT wouldn't be tortured, claiming they were meeting obligations under the Convention Against Torture.
So a multi-pronged attack on the district court's decision. Jurisdiction, foreign policy, practicality, eligibility, and the conditions in El Salvador.
Precisely. They framed the district court's order as going way too far, trying to dictate foreign policy, not just fix a potential legal error. And they absolutely needed at least a temporary administrative stay because that deadline was looming.
So the highest court steps in. How did the Supreme Court rule on this emergency request?
It was a split decision, really. They granted the government's application in part and denied it in part.
Okay, what did they grant?
Well, first, the Chief Justice had already issued a very short administrative stay just to pause things. So that April 7th deadline from the district court was effectively off the table by the time the full court acted. The full court then got rid of that administrative stay.
So the immediate deadline pressure was gone. What about the substance of the order? The part about getting him back?
That's where it gets interesting. The Supreme Court affirmed the part of the district court order telling the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from El Salvador.
Facilitate. Oh,
And they also affirmed the part saying his case should be handled as if he hadn't been improperly removed. This really suggests the Supreme Court agreed the initial removal looked improper.
but didn't the district court order say facilitate and effectuate? Did the Supreme Court affirm effectuate too?
No, that's the part they pushed back on. They found the term effectuate unclear,
Unclear how.
potentially going too far. It might imply ordering specific actions that could step on the executive branch's toes regarding foreign affairs. Remember that deference argument?
Right, the foreign policy powers.
Exactly. So the Supreme Court sent that part, the effectuate part, back down to the district court. It was remanded for clarification.
So the Supreme Court basically said, government, you need to help get him released, facilitate, but district court, you need to be clearer and maybe more careful about exactly how you order that, respecting foreign policy roles.
That's a good summary. And there was also a statement from Justice Sotomayor, joined by Kagan and Jackson.
What did that statement emphasize?
It really underscored the government's ongoing legal duties. It pointed directly to the Convention Against Torture, specific federal laws and regulations about detention and removal.
You mentioned some specific citations earlier.
Yes, things like 8 U.S.C. Section 126A, and specific regulations like 8 CFR Section 287.8 and 241.4. And interestingly, they even cited the government's own internal policy ICE Directive 11061.1, which apparently says ICE should help return people improperly removed while their cases are pending,
So using the government's own rules against them, essentially.
highlighting the expectation that the government follows its own laws and policies. The Supreme Court explicitly told the district court on remand to make sure the government does follow the law here.
Okay. So, wrapping this all up, this Abrego Garcia case has been this incredibly fast-moving legal roller coaster.
It really has, and this deep dive shows that fundamental tension, doesn't it, between executive power in immigration and foreign policy.
And the court's role in checking that power, ensuring due process, making sure laws are followed.
Exactly. It's a textbook example of separation of powers in action, especially when an individual's rights bump up against national security claims or international relations.
And the fact the Supreme Court partially upheld the lower court's order, even with the foreign policy concerns, that seems significant. It suggests a real judicial concern about how he was removed.
I think so, yes. And we have to remember, this isn't over. It's back with the district court now.
Right. They need to figure out exactly what facilitate means in practice and how to frame that order carefully.
Exactly. How the government will actually facilitate his return and how the district court refines its instructions. That's the next chapter. It's definitely something people watching these issues will be tracking closely.
So, as we finish this deep dive, it leaves us, and you, our listeners, with some big questions to think about, doesn't it? What does this case really tell us about the balance of power in immigration?
And maybe, what's the proper role, the extent of judicial power when it comes to protecting rights against government action, especially when national security gets invoked?
Yeah, and looking forward, what are the implications? Could this set precedents for other cases for non-citizens who have existing legal protections here?
Lots to consider. It's certainly a situation with ongoing ripple effects.
Definitely warrants continued attention. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look on the deep dive.